Bionox is motivating wellness. Hello and welcome to Motivating Wellness with Dr. J. And we are all about just that, motivating wellness. I'm Jay Wilkins, the founder and formulator for Bionox. And in our episodes, we'll interview doctors, health experts, personal trainers, and other people that are doing that, motivating wellness. And certainly my next guest is doing just that, motivating wellness. I'm joined today by Dr. Nathan Bryan. I'd like to give a little bit of his background before we start interviewing him. Dr. Bryan earned his undergraduate Bachelor of Science degree in biochemistry from the University of Texas at Austin, and his doctoral degree from Louisiana State University School of Medicine in Shreveport. His 9 years at University of Texas led to several discoveries, which have resulted in over a dozen issued U.S. and international patents, and many more pending worldwide. Dr. Bryan has published a number of highly cited papers and authored or edited 5 books. He is an international leader in molecular medicine and nitric oxide biochemistry. So it's safe to say, Dr. Bryan, like myself, you are a nitric oxide enthusiast. Is that safe to say?
I think that's a fair assessment. Thank you, Jay.
Very good. Well, it's so great to be with you. My first introduction to your work was back in 2010 when I read the book, The Nitric Oxide Solution. And I'm going to be honest with you, I was a guy that was really stoking and shouting about the arginine citrulline pathway from 2005 to 2010. Saw really great results, even with the older population. But then you came along and said, hey, we need to be really looking at nitrates. And I took advantage of the information that you brought out there. I have to say, when I think about nitrates, I think about Nathan Bryan. Back in those days, I think you put beets on the map. Today people recognize beets as a superfood, and I think a lot of it has to do with you and your colleagues and getting the word out there about the benefits of nitrate. So now we have your latest book, which is entitled Functional Nitric Oxide Nutrition, Dietary Strategies to Prevent and Treat Chronic Disease. Excellent book. I've read it several times. You can get this on our website at bionoxusa.com. And again, every time I pick it up and read it, I learn something new. So let's get right into it. It's your turn. We're going to turn the wheel over to you, and you tell us what's going on. So first of all, I think you recognize this molecule back here that I have behind me. So tell us, what is nitric oxide?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think, Jay, this is why I appreciate people like you that give us an opportunity to really educate and inform, because I think it's probably the most important molecule that people don't even understand or recognize, and especially in the lay public. I think we've done a pretty good job over the past 10 or 15 years on educating and informing the public that it's a molecule that's naturally produced in the body. And the older we get, the less we make. And science tells us that it's that loss of nitric oxide that really is responsible for age-related chronic disease, things like high blood pressure, diabetes, Alzheimer's, sexual dysfunction. Every major chronic disease is associated with low nitric oxide, low blood flow, things like that. But it's really what we call a signaling molecule. It's how cells in the body communicate with one another. It's produced in one cell, it acts in a neighboring cell, and basically, for example, in the blood vessels, it's produced in the lining of the blood vessel, and it tells those neighboring smooth muscle cells to relax and dilate, and you get opening up of the blood vessels and improvement in oxygen and nutrient delivery to every cell in the body. But it's also it's a neurotransmitter in the central nervous system. It's how neurons talk to one another and fire. And especially over the past year, it's become extremely important and relevant in immunity. It's how our body fights off viruses, bacteria, other pathogens. And so what we're finding is, not surprising to me, but I think surprising to a lot of immunologists and infectious disease docs, that it's the people that have low nitric oxide that are that are at risk and very susceptible to COVID infection and the rapid progression of disease of COVID. So to me, as a physiologist and biochemist, it makes perfect sense. The problem and the challenge is that no one recognizes this in primary care, even in emergency medicine. So that's why I think it's not just important, but it's critical and necessary that we get the word out about how important nitric oxide is.
Boy, you're right on there. I appreciate that. So you have found the story to be compelling. You're really your life's work. So how does your body make it? How does your body make nitric oxide?
Well, there's really what we found today is there's two primary pathways, and as you mentioned, really back in the 1980s, it was recognized when this whole nitric oxide pathway was being elucidated that you needed arginine to make nitric oxide, and so that pathway was elucidated, and the discovery of an enzyme called nitric oxide synthase. That's the enzyme that's found in the endothelial cells and really every cell in the body as a source of nitric oxide. And then through a very complex, complicated biochemical reaction, that arginine is converted to nitric oxide. But it's a very unfavorable reaction, both kinetically and energetically. But when we're young and healthy, the body makes sufficient nitric oxide when it needs it, and we have optimal circulation, good endothelial function. And so that's the pathway that becomes compromised or dysfunctional with age. And so that's, the body has enormous redundancy. And if nitric oxide is as important as we think it is, then certainly nature would not devise a singular pathway to make nitric oxide in such an unfavorable mechanism of reaction to make nitric oxide. And if you fast forward then probably another 15 or 20 years to the early 2000s, it was recognized that inorganic nitrate, and we can get that from the diet, primarily green leafy vegetables or beets, and then that molecule is actually metabolized into nitric oxide, but it's dependent upon some bacteria that reside in and on our body. It's dependent upon stomach acid production, and then that way the body can actually replete and compensate for the loss of endothelial nitric oxide production. So it's really a concert in harmony of how both pathways make nitric oxide. If one fails, the other compensates. But if we have endothelial dysfunction and we have a poor diet and both pathways fail, that's really when patients start to get in trouble. They have high blood pressure, they develop sexual dysfunction, vascular dementia, diabetes, and the whole progression of disease that many Americans, and not just Americans, but people worldwide are facing.
Yeah, and so I noticed too that in your book you mentioned how if that nitric oxide synthase mechanism is failing, that actually supporting with nitrate-based nutrition, you can actually start to restore the body's ability to make that conversion of arginine, that nitric oxide synthase can get kind of resurrected.
Well, under certain conditions. So and it's a very complex reaction, but really the rate limiting step in that is the oxidation of tetrahydrobiopterin. So when that becomes oxidized, and this occurs in people with oxidative stress and inflammation, then that enzyme becomes uncoupled and you no longer have this beautiful flow of electrons that generates nitric oxide. But if you can maintain that redox balance and have a sufficient pool of reduced tetrahydrobiopterin, then that enzyme can recouple and you can then produce sufficient nitric oxide when you need it in the endothelium.
Got it.
Very good. Everything in biochemistry is based on redox balance and a certain electric potential that you need to transfer electrons from one molecule to the next.
Right. Got it. Thank you. So what are nitrates exactly? How would you explain that?
Well, there's two. So historically, nitrates were always considered organic nitrates, and those are things like nitroglycerin. So in the medical community, when you mention nitrates, immediately physicians and healthcare practitioners think of things like isosorbide. These are drugs that have been used for probably 150, 200 years for the treatment of acute angina. It's also like dynamite, TNT. These are organic nitrates. They're explosive, but Alfred Nobel actually, way back when, in his dynamite factories, his patients would get, or his workers would get these incredible headaches when they worked. So this nitroglycerin was generating nitric oxide in the body, causing cerebral vasodilation. You get these horrible headaches. But he also suffered from angina, and he also recognized that when he was exposed to this, that his angina went away. So that was really the basis for the treatment of acute angina with organic nitrates. But it wasn't until the 1970s that it was recognized that these organic nitrates can be metabolized into nitric oxide. So that's kind of the historical of organic nitrate. But, over the past 20 years, we've recognized what's called inorganic nitrate, and that's NO3 minus. So organic nitrates are nitro groups, NO2 groups, basically bound to a carbon backbone, which inorganic nitrate is just, they're found as salts in nature, and it's the basis of nitrogen-based fertilizers, potassium nitrate, which is used. And so the soil uses nitrate to really assimilate nutrients, and they also assimilate nitrate. And then when we consume these vegetables or consume animals that consume vegetables or grass, then we're getting a source of inorganic nitrate. So that's the basis of it, and it shouldn't be confused, because organic nitrates are have really completely different medicinal values and mechanism of action than inorganic nitrates. Organic nitrates are synthetic, they're man-made. Organic nitrates are naturally occurring in nature.
Gotcha. So what would you say, because now we're going to get into the health benefits of eating these inorganic nitrates from food sources. So what would you say the average American consumes as far as nitrates on the SAD diet, the standard American diet? How much nitrates are they getting a day?
Well, we published on this several years ago, but it's difficult to quantify, and we'll get into that. Every vegetable is different. It's based on farming practice. It's based on different regions. But if you look at an average, the standard American diet, really the best you're getting is about 150 milligrams per day. And we know that the clinical data tell us that you need at least 300 to 400 milligrams in a single serving to get that bolus effect that can generate nitric oxide to affect blood pressure, to affect exercise performance. So it's not surprising to me, like most Americans are deficient in things like magnesium and selenium and chromium and iodine. We have a diet and a population that's deficient in nitrate. And I think the consequences of that are profound, because I think, to me, it explains chronic disease. It explains this epidemic of high blood pressure. 2 out of 3 Americans have an unsafe elevation in blood pressure. Got an epidemic of diabetes. Half of the men over the age of 40 report some degree of sexual dysfunction, and that's self-reported. I think the numbers are much higher because most men don't want to report sexual dysfunction. So to me, this single molecule, nitric oxide, explains every single aspect about human chronic disease.
Gotcha. So if you mentioned most Americans, we will say 150 milligrams at best. We need at least 300 to 400 milligrams per day to, we'll say, create therapeutic amounts of nitric oxide in our bodies. What would you say would be like a maximum amount? I know with the DASH diet, sometimes I can get up to 12 to 1800 milligrams a day or whatever. So what would you say for a therapeutic, if somebody is really in a state of chronic degenerative disease, what would you say a good dosage daily would be?
Well, the clinical data are very clear that in a single serving, you need at least 300 milligrams. Okay. That's minimum. But as you mentioned, we've patterned out things like the DASH diet, the dietary approaches to hypertension, the Japanese diet, a Korean diet, a Mediterranean diet. All of these diets that through years of nutritional epidemiological research have been shown to reduce the incidence of cancer, reduce the incidence of all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease. And so for years, people thought, well, it's just the antioxidant content of that. It's the vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin C. But when you try to recapitulate those data, just supplementing with antioxidants, you fail to reproduce those effects. So we've made an argument, a very strong argument, that it's based on the nitrate content. So the dietary approach to stop hypertension reduces blood pressure, not because it has polyphenols or vitamins. It's because it's providing the body with a source of inorganic nitrate that's metabolized into nitric oxide and lowering blood pressure. So I think that the data are very clear, but there's also a wide range of safety in there, because the DASH diet, which is very beneficial, in some cases you're getting up to 1,500 milligrams, 1,200, 1,500 milligrams per day on that. And nitrate is inert. I think that's an important, the human body cannot metabolize that molecule. So it's dependent upon bacteria, primarily oral bacteria. And then that's where we also run into problems, because we know that 200 million Americans wake up every morning and use an antiseptic mouthwash.
Right.
And that's disrupting these good bacteria. So 200 million Americans are using mouthwash. Over 200 million Americans have an unsafe elevation in blood pressure. Coincidence? I think not.
Yeah, we'll get into some of those things that are causing disruption as well as we go along. But so just to be clear, then the 300 milligrams is where we need to 300 to 400 milligrams. Does it have to be all in one dose, or is it okay to get that just throughout the day?
No, it has to be in one dose because the metabolism is such that you have to get a bolus effect, and then it takes about 60 to 90 minutes for that nitrate to be absorbed in the gut, and then it's concentrated back in our salivary glands. And then each time we salivate, the salivary glands are excreting nitrate, and the bacteria are using that substrate to respire. And as a result, they generate both nitrite and nitric oxide. And then when we swallow our own saliva, we get a burst of nitric oxide in the lumen of the stomach. So it has to be as a bolus to get that effect. You can't take, be exposed to 100 milligrams this morning, 100 milligrams at lunch, and 100 milligrams separate. It's not enough to get that effect. There is a titration level that you need it as a bolus.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. So what are the best ways to measure NO status? And we'll have you answer this in two ways. In the body, what would be the best way as somebody's consuming nitrate-rich or should, hopefully consuming a nitrate-rich diet? How can we measure that effectively? And then subsequently, how can we measure like a supplement itself? I know you have a device that you use, so if you can answer those.
So we consider, really total body nitric oxide availability is really the key determinant of cardiovascular health. And so what we have to do is, figure out which system is working, which system is not, and then figure out how to fix that. So in terms of measuring the ability of the body to convert arginine to nitric oxide, the only way to do that is through, it's called plasmidography. The best way is through flow-mediated dilatation. So there's a technique that's been used for decades. It's called venous occlusion plasmidography. So you can actually put a blood pressure cuff on the brachial artery on the part of the arm, and then occlude that brachial artery, that inflow into the forearm for 5 minutes. And then when you release that cuff, the body's normal response is it recognizes that downstream tissue has been without oxygen for 5 minutes. So when you release that cuff, if your body can generate nitric oxide, you dilate those blood vessels, and you can measure this. There's several devices on the market that do this. But this is a true measure of functional nitric oxide production. It's a non-inclusive or non-invasive measurement, very informative. I don't think enough physicians use it. So that's how we measure if your body's able to convert arginine into nitric oxide.
So like endopat.
Yeah, the endopat.
I'm a big believer in plasmidography testing. That's how we first were measuring results with our arginine-based nutrition,
right,
and seeing really good results with that. So that's a great, I guess, what you call it, indirect measurement of the effectiveness of nutrition.
That's right.
Anything else that can be used? I know you've used strips at the different times. So tell us a little bit about that.
So that's how you measure if it's endothelial function, or your ability for your endothelial cells, so this enzyme nitric oxide synthase to make nitric oxide. Now, if ways to measure if you're getting enough nitrate from your diet, or if your body has this pathway intact, is you can take kind of a standardized nitrate supplement or eat some spinach. And a lot of times that's even not enough, because we've reported that, the amount of nitrate in spinach or different vegetables can be, a 50-fold difference from how that vegetable is grown and where it's grown. But 90 minutes after you consume green leafy vegetables or beets, you can use a test strip and watch the body's ability to convert the nitrate to nitrite. And so I developed a test strip over, 11, 12 years ago, because, Jay, that was really the fundamental question we asked when we started bringing product technology to market was, how do you know if you need nitric oxide? Right. And that's a major problem in mainstream medicine, because it's not like your vitamin D or cholesterol levels where you can draw blood and see what your nitric oxide levels are. You have to figure out a way to do that. And so we were familiar with this enterosalivary circuit and developed technology that you can just apply some saliva to this test strip, and if it turns bright pink, then you know that your body can convert nitrate to nitrite. With a few caveats, and this is really important, but if patients have an active oral infection, they'll turn that pink because the immune system is responding and it's local inflammation or NO production due to the infection rather than systemic inflammation. So I think those are important considerations because there are false positives on that test, and you have to be able to recognize that.
Yeah, that's typical, isn't it? No test is 100%, it seems
That's right.
accurate. Yeah.
If it's
So,
so, it's weird. Yeah.
yeah. So how about your device that basically it sounds like it measures nitric oxide gas that so you have a way of testing like a supplement if to see if it has a bioavailability. How does that work?
Well, there's a couple of analytical instruments that we use in the research lab. One measures nitric oxide gas. It's an ozone-based chemiluminescent machine. It's gas phase. And I think that's important for your listeners. Nitric oxide is a gas. And when it's produced in the body, it's gone in less than a second. So that presents enormous challenges on, number one, how do you measure it in a physiological system? And then number two, how do you restore and replete this molecule, this gaseous molecule in the human body without delivering nitric oxide gas through a nasal cannula or things, which they do, but it's just expensive and cumbersome in the inpatient setting. And then there's an HPLC that we use that really can measure nitrite and nitrate in your blood that's produced or in biological systems. But what I like to do is, there's, as you know, dozens, if not hundreds of nitric oxide products on the market. What we do, I have, I think, over 24 issued patents now through the University of Texas. And so we're obligated to test these products, number one, to see if they're generating nitric oxide, but number two, to see if they're infringing on any patents that I or the university have. So we can manipulate these systems and put it in biological systems or just dissolve it in water and see if it liberates nitric oxide gas. And really, that's the best way to do that. And there's really three classes of nitric oxide categories. Well, generally, but there's really only a class of nitric oxide products, and those are the ones that actually generate nitric oxide that we can measure and quantify and verify. But nitrate's very important because it can be utilized to generate nitric oxide, as we mentioned, but not everybody can do it. I think for a number of reasons. Number one, we're not getting enough in the diet. Number two, we don't have the right oral bacteria. Or number three, our body doesn't make stomach acid. So 200 million Americans using antibiotics, over 200 million prescriptions written for proton pump inhibitors every year. So to me, it's no wonder, it's no mystery why Americans are sick, because we're doing things that are disrupting our own nitric oxide production.
Gotcha. So let's talk about this. So you have a arugula beet salad for lunch, which is my favorite nitric oxide based meal, you might say. I love a roasted beet and arugula salad with goat cheese on it. So let's say, for sake of argument, this salad has 150 milligrams or 200 milligrams, or let's say even with your idea of the ideal, let's say it's got 300 milligrams of nitrates in it. How long is this going to have benefits as you eat that? How long will it give you results for nitric oxide?
Well, I think it depends upon what your endpoint is in terms of the effects of nitric oxide. The easiest to measure is blood pressure. This has been reported in the literature, published literature, that if you can use 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure. But what we know is that if you eat that salad, let's say it contains 300 or 400 milligrams of nitrate, you have the right oral bacteria, you have sufficient stomach acid production, within about 90 minutes, you'll start to see a reduction in blood pressure if you have high blood pressure. So I think the important consideration here, Jay, and this is very important, because if you have normal blood pressure or healthy blood pressure, you're not going to further reduce your blood pressure.
Right.
I think it's a very important point, because
it is
someone's blood pressure that doesn't need to be dropped.
Right.
But if you have high blood pressure, within 90 minutes, you'll start to see the blood pressure come down. And that will last, for 8, 9, 10, 12 hours.
Gotcha.
So just that effect of a single meal will have, lasting effects on blood pressure.
Good. Okay, excellent.
Join Dr. J next time in episode 2 with Dr. Nathan Bryan.